The Age of Strife, a time when Terra's once glorious civilization crumbled into dust. What had once been humanity's golden age of stellar conquest degenerated into a dark and savage epoch, cursed, where knowledge was lost and mutation spread like a blight. Earth fractured, each region a battleground of ferocious warlords, but none were as infamous or deadly as Nordafrik, a land scarred by irradiated wastelands and ruled by brutal, mutant warlords. In these ashen wastelands, where sunlight was often obscured by ceaseless dust storms, a leader rose among the mutants. His name was wrapped in shadows, known only as the Fireborn. But this was no ordinary mutant. He was a Psyker of terrible potency, a creature whose body had been twisted by the untamed energies of the warp, that chaotic, unpredictable realm beyond the physical. His flesh was scarred and torn from the mutations that plagued him, his skin cracked and darkened like burnt stone, and his eyes blazed with psychic fire. The flames were both his gift and curse, an inferno that could consume any who opposed him. With this power, he inspired and controlled the hordes of mutants who rallied under his banner. Yet, the Fireborn's ascension was no simple matter. His early years were spent wandering the ruins of the old world, a solitary figure of pain and wrath, gathering followers from the mutant enclaves hidden deep in Nordafrik's irradiated zones. These enclaves, small, secretive settlements, were the last havens for the outcast, those scarred by the blight of mutation. Generations of radiation and lingering warp exposure had twisted their bodies and minds. They had survived not through strength, but by evading the gaze of the Techno-Barbarian warlords who ruled with iron fists and iron weapons. But in the Fireborn, these exiles saw something far more than another forsaken soul. They saw a being touched by something divine, or something nightmarish, a leader who could bring them into a new age. Over years, the Fireborn amassed an army from the mutant enclaves, each touched in some way by mutation. Some bore thickened skin like natural armor, others possessed strength beyond mortal limits, and many were gifted with psychic powers, though none so formidable as his own. His influence ran like a dark current through Nordafrik's mutant underworld, spreading promises of vengeance and freedom from the tyranny of the Techno-Barbarians. His followers, knowing well the dangers of rebellion, trusted that their loyalty would yield freedom. Under his command, they were no longer mere survivors. They were warriors. The Techno-Barbarians who ruled Nordafrik had long sought to eradicate the mutant enclaves. They considered mutants not just an abomination, but a threat to their power, a symbol of humanity's fall from grace. These warlords wielded brutal weapons, ancient guns, explosive devices, and relics from the dark age of technology, and controlled disciplined armies of warriors. Their ironclad doctrines taught that only the untainted could rule, that strength and purity were virtues, and that mutants were a scourge to be purged from the face of Terra. Their hatred was not just political, it was personal. To them, mutants were reminders of the collapse, of the weakness that had led humanity to the brink. Yet, for all their hatred, the warlords of Nordafrik found themselves unprepared for the Fireborn's uprising. The first whispers of his rebellion were dismissed as rumors, as tales from deserters and mercenaries who had encountered mutant warbands in the deserts and fled rather than fight. It was only when entire towns began to vanish under mysterious circumstances, burned to the ground with no survivors, no signs of life remaining, that they began to fear. Scouts sent into the wastelands returned with tales of entire mutant armies, bearing the Fireborn's emblem, a burning sun, representing both the searing flames of his psychic power and the rise of a new era for the outcast and the mutant. These mutant armies, hardened by years of survival in the irradiated wastes, moved quickly and without mercy. In their raids, they showed no compassion, sparing no one. Settlements loyal to the Techno-Barbarian warlords were burned, the inhabitants reduced to ashes by the Fireborn's psychic flames, and their relics taken as trophies. The warlords soon recognized the Fireborn as not just another warlord, but a force of nature, one that could no longer be ignored. The Fireborn's army grew with each victory, as more mutants came to him, some traveling across Terra's vast wastelands to join his ranks. The fires of his rebellion spread, turning the skies of Nordafrik black with smoke. But as his power grew, so did the extremity of the warlords' measures. They began to enact even more brutal purges against mutant enclaves, slaughtering entire communities in the hopes of depriving the Fireborn of potential recruits. Yet for every enclave they destroyed, it seemed another rose up, inspired by tales of the Fireborn's victories. His legend grew, becoming a story whispered in terror and reverence alike, a story of retribution, of liberation through flame. The Fireborn, ever the strategist, understood that his power lay not just in raw numbers or mutant strength, but in the terror his rebellion inspired. He used fear as a weapon, spreading rumors of his invincibility, of his ability to consume entire armies in a blaze of psychic fire. His own powers only fueled these tales. It was said that in battle, he could channel the very essence of the warp, unleashing storms of flame that reduced even the most hardened Techno-Barbarian soldiers to ash in seconds. The more his legend grew, the more hesitant his enemies became. Yet, with each victory, the Fireborn's hatred deepened, for he knew that he and his people could never truly coexist with the Techno-Barbarians. To them, he and his followers were monsters, creatures to be eradicated. His rebellion was not merely about survival. It was a statement, a claim to existence itself, a refusal to be erased. The Fireborn's war was a war for recognition, a struggle to prove that the mutants of Nordafrik were more than just a footnote in Terra's dark history. As the Fireborn's forces swelled and his legend spread across Terra, his ultimate goal grew ever nearer. The Warlords of Nordafrik, for all their brutality, now faced a threat that could not be defeated by conventional means. The Fireborn's uprising was more than an insurrection. It was a harbinger of a world in which the downtrodden, the mutated, and the castaways could stand on equal footing with their so-called pure-blooded oppressors. And in his mind, he knew that if he could hold out long enough, perhaps Terra itself would recognize the fire within him as something more than a mutation, as something righteous. Yet, even as he tasted victory, forces beyond his understanding and beyond his control stirred on the horizon. For in the shadows of Terra, hidden in his mountain strongholds, the Emperor of Mankind watched. The Fireborn's defiance had reached the ears of the one being who understood both the potential and the peril of the mutant, the Psyker, and the chaos that was now engulfing Nordafrik. And though the Fireborn had yet to encounter the Emperor's forces, he would soon find himself facing a foe far beyond the Techno-Barbarians he despised. In the smoldering wastelands of Nordafrik, the flames of rebellion burned bright. The Fireborn's name became legend, and his rebellion a beacon of hope and vengeance alike. But unbeknownst to him, his fiery uprising was but the beginning of a larger struggle, a war that would reshape Terra and decide the fate of humanity itself. The coalition of Nordafrik's Techno-Barbarian warlords gathered at the plains of Ashadar, casting a grim and determined silhouette across the horizon. Their banners, dark and bloodstained, flapped under the scorching winds as a testament to their brutal resolve. From their ranks came the thunderous rumble of war machines and the snarls of battle beasts bred for slaughter. To the warlords, Ashadar represented the heart of a malignant uprising, a defiled fortress that had once been their stronghold, now held by mutants who sought to overthrow their rule. Within Ashadar's walls, the Fireborn watched from the ramparts, his eyes blazing with the psychic fire that had become his trademark. His lieutenants, each bearing the scars of their mutations and their loyalty, stood at his side, ready to unleash their fury upon the advancing armies. The once grand fortress, now twisted into a fortress of mutants, was fortified with salvaged defenses and layered in makeshift barricades. Psyker sentries lined the walls, their minds connected in a web of psychic energy that pulsed like a heartbeat through Ashadar's stone walls. The Fireborn's gaze fell upon the warlord banners approaching. Lord Draven, a fearsome figure clad in armor adorned with the skulls of defeated foes, rode at the head of the coalition, his darkly gleaming helm marking him as the commander of this united host. Draven was notorious for his cruelty, a ruler who viewed mutants as little more than vermin to be exterminated. His hatred for the Fireborn was personal, stemming from the mutant raids that had decimated his lands and burned his towns. Behind him marched warlord Kalen and matriarch Saraya, each a feared leader in their own right. They represented the strongest warlords of Nordafrik, united by their shared abhorrence of the mutant uprising. The siege began with the coalition forces testing Ashadar's defenses. Draven's warriors advanced in tight formations, wielding crude ballistic weaponry and riotous flamethrowers, their ranks covered by towering battle beasts that snarled and gnashed. The mutants held their ground, fortified behind walls reinforced by Roger's twisted craftsmanship. As Draven's forces drew closer, the Fireborn signaled to his Psykers, and a storm of psychic energy erupted from the walls. Searing bolts of warp lightning tore through the ranks of the Techno-Barbarians, scattering the first wave of attackers like leaves before a tempest. The attackers faltered, and the mutants within Ashadar roared in triumph, their voices rising in defiance. Kavira the Voidseer stood beside the Fireborn, her eyes shining with fierce determination as she muttered incantations under her breath. She foresaw the shifting tides of the battle, guiding her comrades with whispered words that turned the Fireborn's psychic onslaught into a precise and deadly dance. Each blast struck with calculated fury, decimating Draven's soldiers as they struggled to regroup. Yet the coalition was relentless, and the warlords had come prepared for the horrors of mutation. Lord Kalen sent forth his beast handlers, who loosed monstrous, gene-bred beasts, mutated creatures with scales as hard as iron, their jaws lined with rows of jagged teeth. These ferocious beasts surged forward, smashing through the outer barricades with brute force, clawing and gnashing at anything in their path. The mutants met them in a brutal melee, Malachar leading the charge with his iron-hide armor, his towering form striking down the beasts with bone-crushing blows. But the creatures kept coming, relentless and unyielding, threatening to overrun Ashadar's defenders. In the chaos of the battle, Roger unleashed his own creations, mutants he had enhanced with reinforced bone structures and muscle mass, soldiers whose bodies defied conventional anatomy. They clashed with the warbeast in a visceral display of raw strength, the air thick with the sounds of flesh-rending and roars of rage. But even Roger's creations began to falter, for the Coalition's forces outnumbered them, and each mutant lost was a blow to the Fireborn's dwindling army. As the siege wore on, Draven ordered his artillery to fire upon Ashadar's walls, bombarding the fortress with explosive projectiles. The mutant fortifications trembled under the onslaught, cracks forming in the ancient stone as the thunderous blasts shook the earth. Flames licked up from the walls as the mutants scrambled to extinguish the fires, yet the Fireborn stood unshaken, his psychic aura blazing around him in defiance. Realizing the Coalition forces would continue their assault until they breached Ashadar's defenses, the Fireborn devised a counterattack. He ordered Kavira to lead a detachment of mutants through hidden tunnels beneath the fortress, ancient passageways built long before the Age of Strife. With her visions guiding her, Kavira led her troops through these dark corridors, emerging behind the Coalition's artillery lines. In the dead of night, they fell upon the gunners with savage precision, silencing the guns in a storm of blood and fire. The Coalition forces, caught off guard by the ambush, scrambled to defend their artillery positions, but Kavira's raiding party struck with ruthless efficiency. Psyker mutants unleashed bursts of psychic force, hurling soldiers across the battlefield like ragdolls, while Kavira herself wielded a twisted staff that channeled her warp-gifted visions into blasts of energy that reduced enemies to charred remains. The Coalition's artillery lay in ruins by dawn, their gunners slain, and the Fireborn's forces returned to Ashadar victorious, though battered and bloodied from the night's skirmish. Yet for every victory, the Fireborn knew the cost of holding Ashadar was rising. His forces were dwindling, and the Techno-Barbarians would not relent. As dawn broke, Lord Draven ordered an all-out assault, summoning every available soldier to take the walls of Ashadar. The Coalition's warriors surged forward in a tide of flesh and metal, determined to breach the fortress or die trying. The Fireborn rallied his forces, his voice booming across the battlefield, reminding them of their purpose, of the freedom they fought to claim. The fighting grew desperate. Draven's warriors breached the outer defenses, and combat spilled into the streets of Ashadar itself. House by house, room by room, the mutants and Techno-Barbarians clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The Fireborn led from the front, his psychic flames incinerating any who dared stand before him. He moved like a wrathful avatar, his mind a conduit of fire and fury. Beside him, Malachar fought with savage abandon, his iron hide absorbing blow after blow as he ripped through enemy lines. Amid the carnage, the mutants fought with a ferocity born of desperation. each one knowing that they fought not only for their lives, but for their very right to exist. The Techno-Barbarians believed them to be aberrations, a stain upon Terra that needed cleansing. Yet in that moment, the mutants fought with a sense of unity and purpose that transcended their mutations. They were soldiers now, bound not by blood or heritage, but by a shared struggle. But for all their tenacity, the mutants were losing ground. Lord Draven's elite warriors, armed with devastating weapons salvaged from the ruins of past wars, pushed deeper into the fortress, their strength and numbers overwhelming the mutant defenders. In the face of inevitable defeat, the Fireborn made a final, desperate decision. He called upon the full force of his psychic power, reaching deep into the warp and drawing forth flames that burned with unnatural intensity. His psychic scream echoed through the minds of all who fought within Ashadar, searing into the minds of mutants and techno-barbarians alike. A great firestorm erupted within the fortress, a towering inferno that consumed everything in its path, both ally and enemy, mutant and techno-barbarian. The very air crackled with psychic energy, and the flames took on an eerie, almost sentient quality, as if guided by the Fireborn's fury. As the inferno raged, Lord Draven himself confronted the Fireborn amidst the flames. They met in a clash of wills and weapons, Draven's powered gauntlets striking with brutal force against the Fireborn's blazing aura. The two titans fought in a maelstrom of fire and steel, their blows shaking the ground. But the Fireborn's rage was unmatched, and with a final blazing strike, he unleashed a torrent of psychic fire that engulfed Draven, reducing the warlord to a charred husk within seconds. Yet, even with Draven slain, the siege had taken its toll. Ashadar lay in ruins, its walls shattered and its defenders decimated. The Fireborn's forces had held, but at an unimaginable cost. The fortress, once a beacon of mutant defiance, was now little more than smoldering rubble. The mutants who survived gathered around the Fireborn, their faces filled with equal parts awe and dread, for they had seen the true depths of his power and the destruction it could bring. In the aftermath of the siege, the Fireborn's victory felt hollow. He had won, but Ashadar was lost, its people scattered. The coalition was broken, but the price had been steep. As the dust settled and the ashes cooled, the Fireborn looked to the horizon, realizing that his war against the Techno-Barbarians was far from over. The fires of rebellion still smoldered, but now he would need to gather new allies and seek out fresh strongholds if he hoped to continue his fight. For in the heart of Terra, in the shadows of the Himalayas, another figure watched with keen interest. The Emperor had seen the fire of the Fireborn's defiance and recognized its strength, but he also saw the danger it posed to the order he sought to impose on Terra. Soon the Fireborn would face a new adversary, one far greater than any he had known before. Ashadar lay in ruins, the battlefield strewn with the shattered remnants of a war that had consumed everything in its path. In the following days, the Fireborn and his surviving commanders, Kavira, Malakar, and Ragur, held council within the ashes of Ashadar. They knew their position was precarious. The coalition of techno-barbarian warlords had been shattered, but many of its members remained, nursing their wounds and thirsting for vengeance. Scouts reported that the surviving warlords were regrouping to the north, seeking allies to raise a force strong enough to crush the mutants once and for all. "We cannot face them alone," Kavira said, her voice steady but laced with fatigue. Her visions had served the Fireborn well, but even her foresight could only reveal so much against the vast numbers of their foes. "The warlords' hatred for us grows with every passing day. They'll be back, and next time, they'll bring more than just soldiers and beasts. I've seen shadows moving, whispers of something beyond the horizon." The Fireborn nodded, his expression solemn. He sensed it too, a growing presence, an aura of power that loomed over Terra, closing in on Nordafrik and all other techno-barbarian territories. It was something he couldn't fully comprehend but felt deeply, a watchful force observing his every move. He had dismissed it as a product of the warp's influence, but now the weight of it was undeniable. "We cannot remain here," he said, his voice as steady as steel. "Ashadar has served its purpose. It was our beacon, a signal to the warlords that we would not be cowed. But it is no longer safe. We must find new ground, gather new allies, and if necessary, reach beyond Nordafrik. There are others on Terra who live as we do, outcasts hunted by those who see them as nothing but animals. They too burn with the fire of survival. We will bring them to our cause." With this decision made, the Fireborn ordered his followers to begin the arduous task of abandoning Ashadar. They salvaged what they could from the fortress ruins, carrying weapons, armor, and supplies on makeshift carts. Malachar and Ragur led patrols, guarding the caravans as they began their trek across Nordafrik's wastelands. Alongside them marched mutants of every shape and form, their mutations grotesque but their determination unshaken. Some were mutants with unnatural strength, others bore psychic gifts, and still others possessed traits that rendered them resistant to radiation, making them invaluable scouts in the irradiated lands. As they journeyed northward, the Fireborn sent emissaries to the scattered mutant enclaves hidden in the region. In their message, he called upon all who had been outcast or scorned, all who had endured the cruelty of the Techno-Barbarians, to unite under his banner. Rumors of his triumph at Ashadar had spread swiftly, tales of the fiery Psyker who had single-handedly decimated the armies of Lord Draven and defied the strongest warlords of Nordafrik. His call resonated with mutants and Psykers alike, and they began to arrive. Small bands of exiles, lone wanderers, and entire families who had once hidden in the shadows. Each new arrival brought their own abilities and stories, tales of persecution, survival, and rebellion. One such group was led by Iskar the Stonebound, a mutant with skin that had turned to rock over years of exposure to warp energies. His body was heavy, his movements slow, but his strength was unmatched, and his people revered him as a symbol of endurance. Alongside him came a cadre of mutants with stone-like exoskeletons, resilient but weighed down by their mutations, each one a living fortress in battle. Others were outcasts from the Indonesic bloc, a region once dominated by the psychic rebellions. They had fled after the warlords of Indonesia unleashed brutal purges to exterminate Psykers and mutants alike. These new allies, psychically gifted and well-versed in survival, added to the Fireborn's ranks, bringing powers that only strengthened his cause. Under his guidance, they trained, learning discipline and tactics, becoming more than mere outcasts. They became an army. The Fireborn's following grew, yet his every step felt haunted by the presence he had sensed at Ashadar. The visions Kavira had warned him about grew darker, shadows lengthening in her mind's eye, clouding her foresight. She began to speak of a figure in golden armor, a shadow with the power to alter the very fabric of existence. Her warnings were increasingly cryptic, but they left an indelible mark on the Fireborn's mind. Then, as they crossed the high plains of Nordafrik, they encountered a figure who would change the course of their struggle, a mutant wanderer known as Old Zahri. Zahri was a relic of an earlier age, a figure who seemed as ancient as Terra itself. Her skin was like parchment, her eyes clouded with cataracts, yet she moved with the calm and certainty of one who had seen countless ages pass. She claimed to have once walked with those who had preserved fragments of the dark age of technology, wandering as a healer and a keeper of forgotten lore. The Fireborn approached her, drawn by an instinct he could not explain. He spoke to her in a hushed tone, his mind seeking answers to the questions that had plagued him. Zahri, with her knowing gaze, seemed to understand his unspoken doubts. She offered him a prophecy in return, a story from the days before Old Night. "Listen well, Fireborn," she said, her voice a whisper against the howling winds. "Before the age of strife, humanity wielded power over flesh and mind, over the stars themselves. But we grew arrogant, we tampered with what should not be touched. The warp opened its maw, and we fell into darkness. Now, there are forces on Terra who seek to reclaim what was lost, to control not just men, but the very blood in their veins." Zahri's words struck the Fireborn like a hammer blow. She spoke of the Emperor, though she did not use his name. She spoke of a being who had been waiting, watching Terra's downfall, waiting for the moment to step forth and seize control over humanity's fate. The Fireborn felt a chill as he listened, as if the shadows Kavira had foreseen were gathering around him. "What do I face, old woman?" he asked, his voice tinged with both reverence and dread. "You face a power unlike any warlord," Zahri replied. "He will offer you peace, perhaps even understanding. But beware, for his peace is built on the bones of those who do not submit. His vision is vast, and it holds no place for those born of mutation. You, Fireborn, are an anomaly, a flame that defies his order." The Fireborn stood silent, pondering her words. He had faced countless warlords, armies, and beasts, yet this prophecy spoke of something far more insidious, a power that would not merely attack him, but seek to erase him, to undo his existence. His defiance, the very essence of his being, was anathema to this shadowed figure. "Then we must grow stronger," the Fireborn said finally, determination hardening his voice. "We must build more than an army. We must become a symbol, a fire that no shadow can extinguish." Old Zari nodded, her gaze distant. "Your fire burns bright, Fireborn, but remember this, the brightest flames cast the deepest shadows." With her warning lingering in his mind, the Fireborn resumed his journey, his resolve fiercer than ever. He would not merely fight for survival. He would fight to forge a world where mutants, outcasts, and Psykers could live without fear. In his heart, he knew that the being Zari spoke of would come for him, that this emperor would see his existence as a threat. But the Fireborn had faced extinction before, and he would face it again. His people continued their march, their numbers growing, their spirits unbroken. He knew that war awaited them, not only against the Techno-Barbarians, but against a power that could snuff out his rebellion before it truly set Terra ablaze. And as he led his followers across the plains, a single thought burned in his mind like the flames he commanded. He would be more than a leader. He would be a legend. The exodus from Ashadar had forged the Fireborn's followers into a hardened band of survivors, but their numbers had dwindled. The road north through Nordafrik was as brutal as the battles they had left behind, with irradiated storms sweeping across the wastelands and nomadic marauders preying on those too weak to defend themselves. Yet, despite the hardships, the Fireborn's determination only grew stronger. His every step was driven by the vision of a future free from the oppression of Techno-Barbarian warlords, a world where mutants could live without the perpetual threat of eradication. As the mutant army traveled deeper into Nordafrik, word spread of the Fireborn's rebellion. Rumors of the destruction of Ashadar and his defiance against Lord Draven's coalition painted him as both a hero and a terror. Along their journey, the Fireborn sent out scouts and emissaries to hidden mutant enclaves across the region, urging them to unite and resist the warlords' oppression. Many of these groups had long survived on the fringes, concealed from human settlements and accustomed to their isolation. Some were skeptical, unwilling to believe that a Psyker could lead them to anything other than doom. But others came, heeding the Fireborn's call, and joined the march, swelling his ranks with fresh determination. During this time, a new figure entered the Fireborn's camp, one who would become a crucial ally in his struggle. Known only as Seherin, she was a powerful Psyker from the distant lands of Indonesia, a region ravaged by the psychic rebellions. Tall and shrouded in flowing dark robes, her eyes glowed with an eerie light, giving her the appearance of seeing beyond the present moment. When she arrived, she claimed to bring a vision of the future, a warning of forces gathering in the distant mountains to the east, preparing for a conquest that would sweep across Terra and extinguish the flames of rebellion. The Fireborn met her with cautious curiosity, for he had always been wary of other Psykers. But Seherin's insight was profound, and her vision was compelling. "There is a shadow growing over Terra," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "A being of great power rises from the mountains. He gathers an army, warriors unlike any we have seen, armored giants forged to carry his will. He will seek to bring order, but his vision holds no place for those like us." The Fireborn listened, his expression unreadable. He had sensed something powerful in the far reaches of his mind, an unseen force that had brushed against his psychic senses like a cold wind. He remembered old Zari's prophecy, the words she had spoken to him in the desolate plains, warning him of a golden figure who would threaten everything he fought to preserve. The Fireborn could feel this power's presence growing, an unseen force that tugged at the edges of his awareness. "Why do you come to me with this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Why not join this force if it is so powerful?" "Because his vision is poison," Seherin replied, her eyes fierce. "He will demand obedience, total submission. He offers peace, but only if we erase what makes us different, what makes us powerful. Those who refuse will be crushed beneath his golden boot." A heavy silence fell over the camp as the Fireborn weighed her words. He had no love for the Techno-Barbarians or their tyrannical rule, but the thought of a new ruler imposing an even stricter order, one that demanded the purity of blood and mind, was intolerable. He glanced at his followers, mutants of every shape and form, each bearing the scars of survival, each living proof of defiance. They had endured centuries of oppression, and he would not allow them to be extinguished by yet another self-proclaimed savior. "We will resist," he declared, his voice resonating through the camp. "This force in the mountains may be powerful, but we will not submit to any tyrant, no matter what promises he makes. We are mutants. We are the fire that refuses to be snuffed out." With Saharan's insight, the Fireborn began organizing his followers with renewed purpose. His forces had grown, but he knew that sheer numbers would not be enough. They needed more than a strong will to face this coming threat. They needed strategy, unity, and allies beyond Nordafrik. The Fireborn instructed Saharan to gather the Psykers among his ranks, forming them into an elite corps of warp wielders who would train together, strengthening their psychic power to shield the army and strike at their enemies' minds. With her guidance, they forged a bond through shared visions, creating a psychic network that enhanced their power. A dangerous tactic, for it meant that failure could affect them all, but it also made them a formidable force. Beyond Nordafrik's borders, the Fireborn's messengers reached out to mutant enclaves and hidden Psyker communes scattered across Terra. Most were wary, accustomed to survival in the shadows, but some answered his call. They brought their own stories of persecution and whispered tales of the Golden One rising from the east, a figure whose shadow seemed to touch every corner of Terra. Slowly, these scattered groups began to rally, joining the Fireborn's movement in small bands. Each group brought unique skills and knowledge, from the biomagi of the Pan-Pacific gene cults to the mystics of the blasted European arcologies. Together, they began to create something Terra had never seen before, a unified mutant army. Then, as the mutant force moved through the wastes of Nordafrik, they encountered an ancient fortress built into the crags of a mountain range. Known as Khorak's Redoubt, it had once been a stronghold of a forgotten Techno-Barbarian tribe, but had long since been abandoned. The fortress had decayed over the centuries, its walls eroded by storms, its battlements overgrown with alien flora. But beneath the layers of dust and ruin, its foundations were strong, and its location offered a defensible position, sheltered from the open plains and protected by natural cliffs. The Fireborn seized Khorak's Redoubt, seeing it as the ideal headquarters for his growing army. His followers, though weary from their travels, set to work repairing the fortress, constructing barricades and fortifying its defenses. Psykers etched wards of protection into the walls, sealing the Redoubt with spells that would guard against intrusions, both physical and psychic. As the weeks passed, Khorak's Redoubt transformed from a forgotten ruin into a fortress of defiance, a symbol of the mutant resistance. At night, the Fireborn and his Psykers gathered in council, their minds joining in a great web of psychic power. Saharan and Kavira led them in visions of what was to come, showing glimpses of the coming conflict, each image more unsettling than the last. They saw armies clad in golden armor, wielding weapons that could tear through walls and lay waste to entire cities. They saw towering figures, the Thunder Warriors, beings of terrifying strength bred solely for battle. And at the center of it all, they saw the figure in golden armor, a man whose presence radiated an aura of absolute authority. The visions grew more vivid, more consuming. Some of the mutants who joined the Psykers' council began to weaken, their minds strained by the intense visions. But the Fireborn pressed on, determined to understand the nature of this enemy. He saw that the coming conflict would not be like the skirmishes he had fought against the Techno-Barbarians. This was a force unlike any other, a force that sought to impose an order upon Terra, an order that had no place for mutants, Psykers, or those tainted by the warp. One night, during one of these psychic councils, Saharan's vision brought her to the brink of consciousness. She began to tremble, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she uttered a prophecy that sent chills through the gathered Psykers. "He is the light," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But he casts a shadow deeper than any darkness. His order will demand purity, and his peace will be forged in blood. Those who are touched by the fire will be extinguished." Her words hung in the air, a warning as cold as the winds that howled through the Redoubt. The Fireborn felt the weight of her prophecy settle over him, a heavy mantle of responsibility. He knew that this Golden One would bring an end to the mutant enclaves, the Psyker communes, the bio-magi cults, everything that had endured on Terra's margins, clinging to life despite the odds. Yet in the face of this prophecy, the Fireborn's resolve only grew stronger. He rose before his followers, his eyes ablaze with the psychic fire that had earned him his name. His voice carried across the Redoubt, fierce and unyielding. "We have seen the shadow of this new tyrant," he declared. "He believes he can bring peace through submission, through the extermination of everything he deems impure. But we are more than his vision of humanity allows. We are fire, forged in the crucible of survival, and we will not be snuffed out." His followers roared in response, their voices echoing through the mountain passes. They were warriors, outcasts, and survivors, united by a cause that transcended their mutations. Under the Fireborn's command, Khorak's Redoubt became more than a fortress. It became a symbol of defiance, a bastion against the rising tide of a new and unyielding order. As Terra itself seemed to darken under the Emperor's expanding influence, the Fireborn and his followers prepared for the storm to come. They trained harder, forging weapons from the scraps they scavenged, honing their psychic abilities to a razor's edge. For they knew that soon the armies of the Emperor would march upon them, bearing the banner of humanity's new dawn. But in Khorak's Redoubt, the mutants of Nordafrik gathered beneath a different banner, a banner that bore the mark of flame, a flame that would resist, defiant, until the very end. The fortress at Khorak's Redoubt had become more than a shelter. It was a defiant citadel against a world that sought to erase the Fireborn and all who followed him. From its towering battlements, mutants, psykers, and exiles gathered to defend a way of life built on survival and resistance, their unity as unyielding as the stone walls they had raised. But the Fireborn's followers were keenly aware that their existence hung in the balance, threatened not only by the Techno-Barbarian Warlords of Nordafrik, but by the enigmatic power rising from the distant east, the shadow of the Emperor himself. It was only a matter of time before this golden figure took note of the defiant mutants entrenched at Khorak's Redoubt. One day, as a red sun dipped below the horizon, casting a bloody glow over the fortress walls, a pair of figures appeared on the path leading to the fortress gates. They wore golden armor of a kind that the Fireborn's warriors had never seen, elegant yet functional, decorated with sigils of power that seemed to hum with barely contained energy. At their sides were weapons of an unknown design, relics from the forgotten past, refined and perfected to a deadly edge. The envoys were two of the Emperor's proto-custodians, handpicked for their strength, loyalty, and unmatched skill in combat. Their arrival sent a wave of tension rippling through the fortress, as many mutants had never before seen humans who could radiate such authority. The Fireborn himself was alerted immediately, and his inner circle quickly assembled in the main hall. Kavira, Malakar, and Saharan took their places at his side, each tense with anticipation. The Fireborn regarded his lieutenants, then signaled to the gatekeepers. "Let them enter," he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "If they have come to threaten us, let them know that we do not fear them." The gates creaked open, and the proto-custodians strode into the hall, their polished armor gleaming in the fading light. Their faces were impassive, their eyes cold and calculating, taking in the strange, mutated forms of the gathered followers without a flicker of surprise or disgust. They radiated an aura of confidence, as if they already knew how this meeting would end. But the Fireborn's followers held their ground, their eyes flashing with defiance. The leader of the envoys, a tall, imposing figure, took a step forward and addressed the Fireborn directly. "I am Vandros, a servant of the Emperor of Mankind. He sends us with a message, one that offers you and your people a chance for survival in the new order he will bring." The Fireborn's gaze was unyielding, his psychic fire casting a faint glow that danced in his eyes. "Speak then," he said, his voice steady. "Tell me of this order your Emperor dreams of." Vandros's voice was as firm as iron, his words carefully measured. "The Emperor seeks to end the divisions that have torn Terra apart for centuries. He will unify all who remain under his banner, building a world where warlords, rogue psykers, and mutations will no longer threaten humanity's survival. He has seen the dangers of unchecked power, and he seeks to restore order, purity, and strength. A murmur rippled through the gathered mutants, a mix of disbelief and anger. Vandros continued, his gaze never leaving the Fireborn. The Emperor is merciful, and he offers you a choice. Submit to his rule, renounce the chaos of the warp that corrupts you, and accept a place within the new Imperium he will forge. Those who serve him loyally will be spared, but if you resist, then the fires of your rebellion will be extinguished. The Fireborn's lips curled into a grim smile. And what place does your Emperor envision for those of us born with the touch of the warp? For the mutants, the Psykers, the outcasts who were cast aside long before he began his conquest? Vandros's expression did not change. The Emperor's vision is one of purity. The mutations that have spread across Terra are a symptom of humanity's fall from grace. There is no place in his Imperium for aberrations or abominations of nature. But he is just. Those who surrender may yet find mercy. At this, Malachar took a step forward, his iron hide glinting under the torchlight, his voice a low growl. Mercy? For us, mutants? You think we will surrender to a tyrant who believes we should not exist? The proto-custodian's gaze shifted to Malachar, his expression unflinching. Your kind are relics of a time best forgotten. A unified Terra has no room for the chaos you represent. The Fireborn felt his own anger ignite, a righteous fury born of centuries of suffering, oppression, and survival. He took a step forward, meeting Vandros's gaze head-on, his psychic power pulsing like an uncontainable flame. Your Emperor seeks to erase us, to cleanse us from the future he envisions. But we have survived despite the horrors of Terra, despite the curses of the warp. We are fire, Vandros, a fire that refuses to be extinguished. We are what humanity has become, and if he cannot accept that, then we will show him the cost of denying our existence. Vandros's eyes narrowed. You choose defiance, then? The Fireborn straightened, his voice reverberating through the hall with unbreakable resolve. We choose freedom. At this, Vandros nodded, as if the answer was one he had expected all along. He motioned to his fellow custodian, and they turned, heading for the gates without another word. As they left the hall, Vandros cast one final glance over his shoulder. You have chosen your fate, Fireborn. The Emperor's armies will come, and when they do, there will be no mercy. The gates closed behind them, sealing off the Fireborn's fortress from the cold night beyond. The mutants stood in silence, absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. The Emperor had sent his envoys with an ultimatum: submit or be destroyed. There was no middle ground, no path that allowed them to exist in the Emperor's world without compromise. The Fireborn turned to his followers, his gaze fierce. The Emperor has declared us a threat because he fears us. He would see us erased, our lives crushed under his vision of purity. But we will not bow to his tyranny. We will stand and we will fight. We have faced death 1,000 times before, and we are still here. This Emperor believes he can break us, but he does not know the strength that is born of survival, the power of those who have walked through fire and emerged unbroken. His words reignited the defiant spirit that had driven them to Ashadar, that had carried them through the wastelands to Khorak's Redoubt. The mutants roared their approval, their voices rising in a fierce battle cry. They would not be silenced, not by the Emperor or any force he commanded. Kavira stepped forward, her eyes glinting with a visionary fire. The Emperor underestimates us. He thinks us divided, isolated, but we have allies across Terra, mutants, Psykers, those the Imperium would see erased. We must reach them, show them they are not alone. Saren nodded, her voice quiet but resolute. If we stand together, if we gather our strength, we can be more than survivors. We can be a beacon for all who live under the shadow of the Imperium. The Fireborn listened, his mind racing as the seeds of a plan began to form. The Emperor had power and resources, true, but the Fireborn had something the Imperium could not understand. Hope, a unity born not of dominance but of shared struggle. If he could gather the scattered enclaves, unite Terra's Psykers, mutants, and outcasts under one banner, they might stand a chance against the Emperor's oncoming storm. We will send word to every enclave, every hidden community, every last soul who has been cast aside by this vision of purity, the Fireborn declared. Our message will be clear. The Emperor brings tyranny disguised as salvation. But here, with us, there is another path, a path where no one is silenced, where none are erased. He turned his gaze to the eastern horizon, where the Emperor's armies would soon march. The shadows of those golden warriors, the looming threat of thunder warriors and proto-custodians filled his mind, yet his resolve did not waver. He knew that what he faced was greater than any foe he had encountered before. But for the Fireborn, there was no other choice. They would stand in defiance of this Emperor, a united force of the marginalized and the scorned, a fire that would blaze across Terra, even if it consumed them in the end. Thus, under the cloak of night, the Fireborn's envoys were dispatched once more, riding to the far reaches of Terra to rally the outcasts and rebels, to forge a coalition that could stand against the Imperium's dream of absolute control. For he knew that, no matter the odds, their flame would burn fiercely until the last breath. The Emperor would come, but he would find a world unwilling to bow meekly to his vision. Khorak's Redoubt became a gathering ground for mutants and Psykers from across Terra, their numbers swelling as they prepared for the storm. And the Fireborn, now truly the beacon for all those deemed aberrations, prepared his people to resist the Emperor's army, a defiance that would echo across Terra, even if it was destined to end in fire. The wind swept across Khorak's Redoubt, carrying with it the sounds of preparation and urgency. News had arrived of a great force marching toward them, the Emperor's own Thunder Warriors, his proto-custodians, and legions of warriors bred and trained for one purpose alone, the unification of Terra under his iron rule. For the Fireborn's forces, this meant one thing: the final battle was upon them. Mutants, Psykers, biomagi, and exiles from every corner of Terra had gathered, filling the fortress to capacity. Over the past weeks, the Fireborn's envoys had rallied allies from distant lands, bringing a new swell of hope to his followers. His forces now included the mutant enclaves of Old Europe, the indelible Psykers, and even outcasts from Pan-Pacific gene cults. Together, they forged a defiant coalition, a unified army of those Terra had deemed aberrations. They were more than an alliance. They were kin, bound by survival against a world that had rejected them. Inside the fortress walls, preparations intensified. Malachar, the iron-skinned warrior, drilled his troops, instilling discipline among mutants who had once lived only by scavenging and survival. Kavira, the Voidseer, gathered the Psykers into a council, preparing them to weave their powers into a great psychic shield that could defend against the brutal force of the Emperor's legions. Roger, the Flesh Shaper, worked with biomagi from Pan-Pacific, enhancing mutants' physical abilities, reinforcing their bones, and imbuing their bodies with defensive augments. Every corner of Khorak's Redoubt buzzed with purpose, an army determined to resist the Emperor's vision at any cost. In the hours before dawn, Saharin, the indelible Psyker, approached the Fireborn. Her expression was troubled, her eyes distant with the weight of recent visions. "The Emperor's forces are closer than we thought," she warned. "They march in numbers that blot out the ground itself. This will not be a battle of equals, Fireborn. We face extinction." The Fireborn's face was impassive, his gaze unflinching as he looked out over the fortress walls. "Extinction is what they have threatened us with since the dawn of this cursed age of strife. If we must die, then let it be in defiance. Let our last stand become a warning to those who seek to impose their will on us." Saharin nodded, a steely resolve hardening in her gaze. "Then we will show them what it means to face the Forsaken." At the break of dawn, the Emperor's forces appeared on the horizon. Row upon row of soldiers marched with disciplined precision, their golden armor gleaming in the early light. The proto-custodians led the vanguard, towering warriors whose armor and weapons radiated an aura of authority and power. Behind them came the Thunder Warriors, giant, genetically enhanced soldiers, each a mountain of muscle and armor, bred for war, and wielding weapons that seemed to hum with untold lethality. And towering over even the Thunder Warriors, like avatars of Terra's wrath, were the Emperor's dreadnought war machines, bipedal constructs of destructive power, each step reverberating through the earth as they closed in on Khorak's Redoubt. The sight of the advancing army sent a chill through the gathered mutants. Many had never seen such discipline, such technology, such raw and calculated power. Yet the Fireborn's presence steadied them. He stood on the ramparts, his psychic aura blazing, casting an ethereal light over the walls of the fortress. "Look upon them," he called, his voice carrying across the redoubt. "They come to erase us, to silence the fire that has burned within us for generations. But we will not be erased. Today we show Terra that we are more than they ever believed." His words drew a roar from his followers, a cry of defiance that echoed across the plains, defiant even in the face of certain doom. The Emperor's forces halted a few hundred meters from the fortress, and silence fell over the battlefield. Then a lone figure emerged from their ranks, walking calmly toward the gates of Khorak's Redoubt. Dressed in resplendent golden armor, he radiated authority and power, his every movement resonating with a quiet menace. This was not the Emperor himself, but Valdor, the Emperor's favored custodian who had been given command over this assault. He stopped before the fortress, his voice booming as he addressed the Fireborn and his followers. "The Emperor offers you mercy," Valdor called, his voice both cold and resolute. "Surrender now, and those of you who renounce your twisted ways will be granted a place in the Imperium. Resist, and you will be crushed beneath the weight of the Emperor's will." The Fireborn's laughter rang out over the battlements, sharp and defiant. "Your Emperor has made his terms clear, and so have we. We will not yield, we will not bow to purity, nor bend to a tyrant's vision of order. We are the unwanted, the cast-asides, the fire that Terra could not extinguish." Valdor's expression remained as inscrutable as ever. He gave a single nod. "Then so be it." With a raised hand, he signaled the assault to begin. The Emperor's forces surged forward, Thunder Warriors leading the charge, their weapons raised high as they thundered toward the walls of Khorak's Redoubt. The Fireborn's Psykers chanted in unison, channeling their energies to create a psychic shield, a flickering, ethereal barrier crackling with power as it deflected the initial wave of attacks. The first Thunder Warriors reached the shield and struck with brutal force, their weapons crashing against the barrier. The Psykers staggered, their energies strained as they fought to maintain the shield. Kavira, directing the psychic effort, poured her strength into reinforcing it, her face pale and glistening with sweat as she strained against the sheer power of the Emperor's forces. But the relentless assault began to splinter the barrier, each blow weakening the delicate psychic web holding it together. As the shield began to falter, the Fireborn gave the order to unleash the Redoubt's artillery. Salvaged heavy weapons, built from ancient scrap and forgotten relics, unleashed a barrage upon the advancing forces. Explosions tore through the front lines, scattering Thunder Warriors and Proto-Custodians alike, but the disciplined soldiers swiftly reformed, pressing forward once more. On the ground, Malachar led his mutant warriors in defense of the gates, his iron hide shielding him from the storm of bullets and shrapnel. His roar echoed through the air, rallying his warriors as they clashed with the Emperor's soldiers in a desperate struggle. Each mutant fought with the ferocity of those defending not just a fortress, but their very existence. The Fireborn's laughter rang out over the battlements, sharp and defiant. "Your Emperor has made his terms clear, and so have we. We will not yield, we will not bow to purity, nor bend to a tyrant's vision of order. We are the unwanted, the cast-asides, the fire that Terra could not extinguish." Valdor's expression remained as inscrutable as ever. He gave a single nod. "Then so be it." With a raised hand, he signaled the assault to begin. The Emperor's forces surged forward, Thunder Warriors leading the charge, their weapons raised high as they thundered toward the walls of Khorak's Redoubt. The Fireborn's Psykers chanted in unison, channeling their energies to create a psychic shield, a flickering, ethereal barrier crackling with power as it deflected the initial wave of attacks. The first Thunder Warriors reached the shield and struck with brutal force, their weapons crashing against the barrier. The Psykers staggered, their energies strained as they fought to maintain the shield. Kavira, directing the psychic effort, poured her strength into reinforcing it, her face pale and glistening with sweat as she strained against the sheer power of the Emperor's forces. But the relentless assault began to splinter the barrier, each blow weakening the delicate psychic web holding it together. As the shield began to falter, the Fireborn gave the order to unleash the Redoubt's artillery. Salvaged heavy weapons, built from ancient scrap and forgotten relics, unleashed a barrage upon the advancing forces. Explosions tore through the front lines, scattering Thunder Warriors and Proto-Custodians alike, but the disciplined soldiers swiftly reformed, pressing forward once more. On the ground, Malachar led his mutant warriors in defense of the gates, his iron hide shielding him from the storm of bullets and shrapnel. His roar echoed through the air, rallying his warriors as they clashed with the Emperor's soldiers in a desperate struggle. Each mutant fought with the ferocity of those defending not just a fortress, but their very existence. Meanwhile, the Emperor's war machines advanced, their last cannons and plasma projectiles targeting the Redoubt's walls. Sections of stone buckled under the assault, crumbling into clouds of dust and debris. As breaches formed, the Thunder Warriors poured in, flooding the Redoubt's interior and locking in close combat with the determined defenders. The Fireborn entered the fray, wielding psychic flames with deadly precision. He unleashed waves of warp energy upon advancing soldiers, his power searing through Thunder Warriors and Proto-Custodians alike. His forces, inspired by his presence, fought fiercely. Yet, the Emperor's forces pressed on unyielding. Their superior training and equipment gradually shifted the battle. Rogger's enhanced mutants displayed unmatched ferocity, but even they began to fall under the sustained assault, their abilities strained against the Emperor's legions. Kavira and her Psykers, sensing the battle slipping from their control, prepared a final maneuver. Channeling the combined power of every Psyker in the Redoubt, they wove a massive storm of warp energy that would unleash itself upon the field. As they chanted, the sky darkened and clouds swirled, as though the warp itself was opening above. The psychic storm tore through the battlefield indiscriminately. Thunder Warriors and mutants recoiled, momentarily stunned by the onslaught. But the Emperor's forces, though staggered, pushed forward, their advance seemingly unstoppable. In a final act of defiance, the Fireborn faced Valdor himself. The two clashed, will against will. The Fireborn unleashed his full power, his flames blazing as he fought to break Valdor's defense. Yet, Valdor's skill was unparalleled. He maneuvered with precision, his strikes calculated. With a final, overpowering move, he broke through the Fireborn's defense, sending him to his knees. Weakened, the Fireborn looked up at Valdor, defiance still in his gaze. "You may defeat me," he whispered fiercely, "but you cannot extinguish our flame. Others will rise, and your Emperor will face resistance in every shadow." Valdor's gaze was cold as he raised his weapon. "Resistance," he said calmly, "is futile."